Hello there everyone, it's Silver. This is Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl. So this is one of those games that we thought may or may not actually happen for quite a long time. It's been a while in the making, and it's nice that it's finally here. Stalker 2 is confusingly the fourth game in the Stalker series, and even though it's a long-running series, it's also been a long time since we've actually had an entry. But props to the developers, to GSC, because they went through some really serious stuff to actually get this finished. Being a Ukrainian studio, there's a lot of stuff in the way of getting a game like this done, so it's really cool that they were able to get this far. So if you've never played one of the Stalker games, what are they? Well, they're a series of pseudo-open world shooters set in a sort of science fantasy version of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where some really crazy stuff happened all the way back in '86, and now it's filled with mutants and strange anomalies, and basically reality is kind of out to lunch in this whole area and doesn't work properly. And I say pseudo-open world because in the past these games were mostly a series of relatively large open areas separated by loading screens. But in this case, this is the first time Stalker is actually fully open world. There are no loading screens separating areas anymore. It is all one large contiguous map, and it is very large. The zone in this case is huge and contains areas from all of the previous games and some new stuff. Although you may be surprised as to how some of the areas connect together, because we're kind of used to some of these areas having loading screens in between them and not being able to just walk straight from one to the other uninterrupted. So sometimes it's a bit interesting to see how they've stitched them together to make one big map. Like, for instance, how the area called Garbage and the area called Red Forest are sort of together now. More or less, they're basically neighbors. And this is just a result of taking all of those loading zones and stuff and stitching them together to form a complete map, and it's actually resulted in a really explorable and fun zone that feels pretty alive, although we'll get into the A-Life stuff a little bit later. So first off, how it looks and sounds. This is a very important part of Stalker because one of the biggest assets of the previous games are their atmosphere. They are extremely atmospheric games with a really nice soundscape and some really good visual depictions of like Soviet-era decay, these sorts of old industrial sites and things that are all rusted out, and there's just a certain really specific, almost post-apocalyptic but not technically atmosphere to everything that is kind of unique to the Stalker games. And in this case, it's actually probably better realized than it's ever been. This game is beautiful to look at. It's extremely pretty. It does hit the system pretty hard. They've done some more optimization passes since the release of the game, and several of the latest patches have increased the performance a bit, so it's not as bad as it was, but it is a relatively demanding game on the highest settings. But this depiction of the sort of rusted out, overgrown zone is probably the best one to date because it's just so atmospheric and nice. And the soundscape also matches this. You'll find that a lot of the music in the game isn't exactly music at all, but instead it's like atmospheric sounds, you know, sort of ambient noises and things, stuff that kind of mixes in with the environment and doesn't sound as much like a soundtrack as much as it sounds like the sort of natural sounds that you would hear going through that area, but it is still technically a part of the soundtrack. It's an interesting mix of more upbeat sort of combat tracks and stuff where you could actually call it music, and then the more exploratory stuff that is just ambient. But the good in the sound design doesn't stop at the music, because the overall soundscape of the game, aside from that as well, is also really, really good this time around. Everything from gunfire sounding really snappy and loud to, you know, call-outs from other stalkers and stuff being helpful to find out where they are and what they're planning, to your just general atmospheric noises, the sounds of the zone, the stuff that just happens passively around you as you explore is all really good sounding and very crisp and clean. So even little details are really nice, like for instance when you walk past a rusted out car while it's raining, as you approach the car you'll hear the sound of rain hitting the sort of hollow metal body of the car get louder, and then it'll sort of go in that ear if you're wearing headphones, and then as you walk away you'll hear it kind of fade off into the distance. It's just little touches like that that are really nice and add a lot to the atmosphere. So overall, audio-visually, this game is extremely impressive to me because it just looks and sounds really good. And it's also in service of a highly effective atmosphere that carries throughout the whole game. And when you're in some of the creepier areas, like the X-Labs or underground areas, then the creep factor really ratchets up. And it's a very dark game in those areas. You do need your flashlight, and your flashlight can only illuminate so much. So there will be areas where you can't see everything that's in front of you, which is a deliberate choice, obviously, to make those areas more creepy, and it does a good job at that. And some of the more forlorn, abandoned underground areas do get really quite spooky as you're exploring them, and it also helps that certain other elements of the game kind of affect this, like the emissions, for instance, the blowouts, which I'll explain in a minute if you've never played Stalker, but these cause lights to flicker. So when you're exploring around, especially underground, and all the lights start flickering and everything starts shaking, that means there's an emission happening up on the surface, and it adds to the tension of what you're going through, because now you can only see intermittently as the lights flicker in and out. There is one exception to how good the game looks, however, and that is due to the game's use of software Lumen. So Lumen is a ray tracing solution that helps with stuff like reflections, and the reflections that this game has in water are excellent looking. They look really good. All the little standing puddles of water on the road as you're exploring will reflect, old power poles in the sky and old decrepit buildings and stuff, and they all look really good. However, there are some areas with different kinds of reflections, the kinds of reflections that you get, say, off of a really shiny floor or a glass surface. Those do not look as good because of the use of software Lumen. Kind of makes it look like there's like white insects crawling all over the reflection. It gives it this weird crawly, flickery look that is just sort of inherent to the way that Lumen is used in a lot of games nowadays. So in some of those areas, especially places like the Circa building, it does get a little bit distracting because everywhere you look, there'll be these weird crawly reflections all over the place. Gameplay-wise, it is still Stalker. It's very much an intact Stalker experience. It has been modernized, but it hasn't really lost that much of its identity or anything, I would say, except for in the A-Life stuff, which again I'll get to a little bit later. But in terms of the overall gameplay loop, it is very Stalker. You're exploring areas, you're finding loot, you're fighting mutants and enemies, and you're getting gear from all of your fallen foes and stuff like that, and taking it back for selling, and then doing some story missions. The only really big difference, I would say, between this game's overall gameplay loop and previous Stalker games is that this game is a lot more scripted than previous Stalker games. I think they actually use the scripting really well in this game, and they make some really fun set pieces and some really good encounters that are scripted to react a certain way to you, so it's a little bit less emergent and a little bit more scripted. Now, this does lose a little bit of its identity because it means that some of the stuff that happened in the previous Stalker games were often cases of A-Life, the game's AI, having all of the various inhabitants of the zone wandering around doing their own things and living their own lives, and sometimes they would just encounter each other and stuff would emergently happen that wasn't scripted to happen, it just did. So, you would find a duty base getting assaulted by freedom soldiers or something like that, and it wasn't a scripted event, it just happened because the freedom soldiers decided to patrol near that area, found the base, and started fighting it. There is less of that now. There's less of groups emergently wandering the zone doing their own thing. They are still there, and you'll still come across like wandering bandit patrols and wandering sets of loners going between campfires and stuff. They're still there. There's just less of it and more of a focus on scripted events that are meant to happen a certain way. However, this is partially because currently, at the time I'm recording this, the A-Life 2.0, the sort of new version of the AI that this game is supposed to use, isn't fully implemented because they couldn't get it fully optimized for the release of the game. Basically, it was causing huge performance problems by having it enabled because of all the calculations for the AI happening all at once, and it was just not worth keeping into the shipped version of the game yet because it would cause everyone huge performance issues if they kept it, so they left it out. This means that the current version of the sort of A-Life idea they have is sort of like a gutted, less powerful version of what's actually meant to be there. However, they do plan on adding in the more finished version once they polish it up better in a free patch. So this all could change, and the idea of the zone feeling a bit more scripted and a bit less emergent could change with it, depending on when and how this new version of their A-Life stuff is actually implemented later on down the line. Gunplay, in my opinion, has gotten a really big upgrade. The weapons just feel really good to use in this game. Even the more basic ones like pistols feel really good. This is the pistol phase of a Stalker game is always really short. Yeah, you're only using a pistol at like the very beginning of the game when you have nothing else to use. In previous Stalker games, you wanted to replace it with just about anything as fast as you could. But in this game, the pistols are actually really effective and they're really fun to use. So you can use them throughout the game if you want to, and you will be getting access to more advanced sort of pistol and machine pistol, that kind of weaponry that matches some of the later ammo types you're going to find, like 45s and stuff. It means that you always have a pretty good variety of weapons, that you could use at any given time, including the pistols now that aren't just a thing to fall back on in an emergency if you have nothing else, but instead are actually a useful part of your arsenal. You also have 2 other weapon slots that you can hold other weapons in, pretty much anything you want, assault rifles, shotguns, SMGs, whatever you find. And all of those have also gotten an increase in their satisfaction and how fun they are to use. One thing that I would criticize the old Stalker games for is that the less powerful assault rifles and the submachine guns feel kind of weak and not that worth using oftentimes. They feel like they're barely doing anything. But in this case, the submachine guns feel like they're kind of shredding everything in front of you. They're quite powerful. They fire really fast, just sort of inaccurately, and it makes them fun to use and kind of unpredictable. Shotguns have a lot of impact now. There are several different shotgun variants, all 12 gauge, that have a couple of different ammo types. By the way, this is a common thing in Stalker games. There are usually like armor piercing variants and expanding variants that are the opposite of armor piercing. They're meant for soft targets. And there are also some other things like, say, shotgun slugs or fletchets. It means that you've got a good variety of weapons and ammo to choose from, and there are lots of viable options. I haven't really come across a weapon that I felt was so weak that it wasn't worth using. Even really basic stuff like the Viper 5, which is basically an MP5 with the serial numbers filed off, it's still pretty effective, and you can use it as much as you'd like, and everything is also upgradable. It uses the Call of Pripyat upgrade system, but it's been altered a little bit, so all of your armor, helmets, and weapons are fully upgradable in a lot of different facets depending on which people you visit, because some mechanics can only upgrade certain things, so you've got to go to a different tech to upgrade some of your more advanced equipment, for instance. But this time around, the upgrades are extremely expensive. Upgrading your equipment costs a lot of money. Repairing it also costs quite a lot of money. There is a durability system, and you really don't want your guns to fall to low durability because they'll start jamming and misfiring and stuff, and you have to spend a lot of time clearing the issues in order to fire them again, which is usually a bad thing when you're being shot at. But yeah, so this expense is a good thing, in my opinion, because in the previous Stalker games, it was easy to make so much money that you never had to worry about money again. You could just, find some artifacts and sell them and just be loaded, and you never really have to worry about it. But in this game, because of the large expense of keeping your gear repaired, especially if it's more advanced gear, the more advanced stuff costs more, and also the fact that the upgrades now cost a lot more, it means that you have sort of a money sink. Now you have a lot more use for money, and it's not just something that you're going to amass a huge amount of and not know what to do with. You actually do need it. You can also find some other types of upgrades or attachments really for your weapons that can change how they work, like suppressors, sights, scopes, underbarrel grenade launchers, and some things like that. Anomalies are cooler than they've ever been. So anomalies are places where the laws of physics have decided to not work anymore and some weird stuff is happening. There are all kinds of different sorts of anomalies, and there are many new ones in this game as well as the return of some of the previous greats, like say the fruit punch anomaly, which is like a big pool of acid that boils up whenever you walk over it, or the electro anomalies that are just like a big concentration of electrical energy that explode out in a big lightning explosion if you get too close to them. So anomalies this time around are more complex than they've ever been because they have more clearly defined borders as well as more clearly defined reset periods, because you can throw bolts, like metal bolts, into anomalies to set them off. And after you do this, there's just a couple of second period where they won't be set off again, and it takes a minute for them to sort of rearm, and this is often time for you to run through them, so you want to trigger them remotely with a bolt and then dash through them as fast as you can before they come back. And this is the case in this game as well. And there are the classic detectors that you need, because the main reason you're going to go into fields of anomalies is to find artifacts, powerful items that are very valuable either for you to equip because they have useful things that they do when you equip yourself with them, or to sell because they're worth a lot of money. And you need a detector to find artifacts. They won't appear otherwise, and different tiers of detector can give you different rarities of artifacts as you go through the game and get better ones. All of the previous detectors from the other games in the series are in this game, with the Velez being the classic best one that you can get, that you only get later on towards the end of the game, or well, the later sections of the game. But there is a new detector as well that has a different use, because it detects artifacts from really, really far away, much farther away than any of the other detectors, and allows you to sort of just know where the general direction is to the nearest artifact to you, even if it's quite a good distance away. And then once you're closer, you want to switch to a more precise detector to find it once you're actually near it. But yeah, the creativity with the new anomalies is pretty cool. You'll find these ones that are like vents that spew out lava towards you, which are a pretty big problem. There are some roaming electrical anomalies that'll actually home in on you now, which is not very nice. And there are some new gravitational things that can just rip you apart in midair. So you've got to be very careful around these things. And they've also added a lot of new anomaly fields in the world for you to find and explore. These are often where you're going to find the best artifacts, but they're also really dangerous. They're not only fields of anomalies kind of dense, so you've got to, carefully use your detectors and stuff to circumnavigate these things because they're often just full of danger, but also a lot of them now have some unique properties that aren't found anywhere else, like say the poppy field anomaly, which is what it sounds like. It's a field of poppy flowers, but it makes you sleepy for some reason when you walk into it, and you start to pass out, and the longer you stay in it, the more blurred your vision gets and the more you eventually pass out. And you'll find that if you stay in it for too long, there's this sort of wind that carries these poppy petals around, and you'll hear some creepy whispers from this wind if it gets close to you, and sometimes this wind will actually go through you and basically shred you and cause huge amounts of bleeding and stuff from the razor sharp petals that it's carrying around. So you've got to be very careful navigating this place because you can pass out or find yourself bleeding out all of a sudden in the middle of the house and not know how you got there. There's also the cage as another example of kind of a creative one. It's weird. It's like a sort of skeleton of a building, like an unfinished skyscraper kind of thing. And you've got to do some really careful platforming and climbing to get around it and get to the top to get some really useful stuff. By the way, you definitely want to get to the top of this one. It has some excellent stuff to find. But the whole time, the anomaly is causing you to hallucinate and is causing your vision to sort of blur and move all around like you're drunk or something. And it makes it really hard to navigate because you're doing all these precise jumps and stuff, but at the same time your vision is seesawing all around the place and getting blurry and stuff. It's a pretty cool experience actually how they've managed to make a lot of these anomalies really unique, and a lot of them aren't just a dense field of anomalies you've seen elsewhere. They also have something unique about them that you only find there. Mutants also all return, and they are more dangerous than ever. A lot of the mutants can now take a lot more punishment before going down. Like, say, bloodsuckers can take several point-blank shotgun blasts before going down. They're also a lot more dangerous because the higher detail of the area makes it harder for you to pick them out when they go invisible, because the blur that they become is a lot harder to see when the environments are this detailed now. You also find that several of the mutants have some extra capabilities they didn't have before, like the poltergeists, for instance, are just a lot more dangerous now. They're much harder to track, and they can throw a lot of things at you at once, including a lot of stuff that was previously like a static object in the previous games, and now is actually something they can lift up and throw at you, which is a problem. Also, the Bureaus can lift up guns and shoot them at you telekinetically, which is a huge problem if you're trying to fight them. They can lift up like several loose guns at the same time and fire them all at you from different angles. And there are also some new mutants to find that I'm not going to spoil, although one of them is a cut mutant from the previous games, the cat. In the previous Stalker games, there was going to be a large sort of almost like mountain lion looking cat that was sort of mutated and had some weird powers, but it was cut from the games. It wasn't finished in time, so it wasn't in the final games, although some modders did add it back into some of their mods, so you can still fight them in some modded versions. But now they have finished them, and they're actually in this game, and they are really mean. They're really fast, they cause a lot of bleeding when they hit you, and they can also put you to sleep and attack you while you're sleeping, and cause you some sort of other psionic problems as they're going around. I would say the combat gameplay in general is really, really good this time around, partially because of the really nice, fun-to-use guns and the really nice sounds of the weapons and things, but also because the combat AI is just pretty good. You know, mutants have a lot of new powers to use against you, so that makes them more fun to fight, and human enemies are just a bit smarter. You know, they'll flush you out with grenades and try to flank you and stuff and communicate with each other, or to give the illusion of communicating with each other, and it makes them an enjoyable fight. So big, large firefights and big open areas tend to be really fun as everyone searches for various bits of cover and tries to attack everyone else from different angles and stuff. It's a really good time, and they've clearly put a lot of effort into the gameplay loop, making it sort of modernized but still very satisfying. Story-wise, the game has quite a significant focus on its story, partially because of its more scripted nature. There's a lot of big story events that happen, and a lot of really mean stuff that happens. Like some of the stuff that happens to you is pretty awful that you have to survive. Like, for instance, say going through a swamp where you can barely walk, and suddenly a chimera spawns behind you and an emission starts at the same time. That's a problem, and the game does this to you and just sort of expects you to live through it, so you got to figure it out. An emission, by the way, is something that happens for the first time in this game as a scripted event. It's scripted to happen at a specific point in the story, and then after that one happens, they become a regular thing that can just happen randomly, usually like once every couple of days or so. And it's basically a case where the sky turns blood red, all of the birds fall out of the sky, and this big wind starts blowing, and you've got maybe 30 seconds or so to find cover. If you don't find cover, then you are guaranteed to die. There's no way to survive outside during an emission, so you've got to find some sort of shelter to survive it. And this time around, the game is a lot more picky about what counts as shelter from an emission. In the previous games, you could just find like a random crappy shack and probably be okay, but now that same shack will not provide you with any cover this time, so you've got to actually find a bit more of a sturdy place to hunker down in and survive an emission. And of course, afterwards, you might have to worry about some zombies or something like that roaming around, the sort of brain-scorched versions of stalkers that were affected by an emission but weren't fortunate enough to die from it, and instead have to walk around all zombified, and you may have to fight them. They can still use guns, by the way, so be careful about those guys. But also, kind of interestingly, as a part of the story, you have several options that will ingratiate you to certain factions and make others hate you. You cannot please all of the factions in this game. Some of your decisions will always make enemies of certain factions and make you allies with others. You can't, you just can't please everyone. So I actually like that. I think that's cool. It adds some extra stuff for future playthroughs, allows you to take a different path through the story if you decide to, but it also allows you to, take part in the faction politics that are happening in the zone, and understand what each of the factions wants and which one you want to side with. Overall, I would say it's sort of a triumphant return for Stalker to be in this kind of state. It is an extremely good game that if you were a fan of any of the previous 3 games, you will find a lot to love here. Like I said, it is a more scripted experience than the games have previously been, and the A-Life is lacking currently because it's not fully implemented. But aside from those things, the zone feels better than ever to explore, being one big contiguous open world as it is. And the overall gameplay loop is just as satisfying as ever, if not more so, because of the extra complexity of anomalies for artifact finding and the extra complexity of fighting mutants for making them just more interesting to fight in general and all that good stuff. There's a lot here to like, and I've had a ton of fun with Stalker 2 so far, and I'm going to continue to play it off screen. This is one of the few games that I'm able to do that with, because I have a limited selection of games that I'm able to still play after I finish covering them, because I have to move on to new projects. But in this case, this is fun enough that I'm going to keep it on my PC for a while and continue to play through it. And of course, this is all not even mentioning the modding possibilities that this game opens up, because some of the best parts, a lot of people would say, of the previous Stalker games are the various mods that were made for it. They are what kept the series relevant all this time while we were waiting for a new entry. And there are some extremely good experiences to be had out there with some awesome mods that are made by very talented and passionate people. So I have no doubt that those people right now are rubbing their hands together and looking at what they can do, breaking into this game and seeing what all they can add and change and stuff. And I have no doubt that in the year or two to come, we'll see some really impressive mods that completely change the game into something else and are also worth playing on their own too. So I'll probably be updating you on some of those when eventually they come out, when the modding scene really gets started. But as it stands right now, I highly recommend Stalker 2. It's a fantastic experience. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for the game if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.